You take cream but no sugar, right?
Right. Thanks.
So, what do you think?
I like it, Sandra. You've done a great job with the kitchen. Easy parallel approaches to the oven and sink. Easy forward approach to the fridge. Lots of maneuvering space. This is well thought out. This is good, accessible design.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hi, I'm Jack Riley. I work for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. One of our most important missions is to enforce the federal requirements for accessibility, making buildings accessible and livable for people with disabilities, their families, and friends. We're in the design studio of Sandra Cook, a practicing private sector architect. Sandra is an expert in the techniques of accessible design, so I've asked her to share her thoughts about accessibility from an architect's perspective. Sandra?
Hi, Jack's being generous. Let's just say that I've closely studied the HUD Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines. I've found creative ways to apply them, and I routinely incorporate them into my designs.
To help you understand the Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines, this video explains why the requirements exist and what they are. We'll briefly look at statutes and regulations, describe the type of buildings they cover, and define some key terms. Then we'll explain each of the 7 guideline requirements in more detail and give you practical suggestions for incorporating them into your designs.
HUD's Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines are an important resource. I always keep a copy handy as a ready reference. In addition to the guidelines, the preamble contains practical and useful background information. And the guidelines really cover quite a lot, so use them to get the specifics. The guidelines contain the details you'll need to design housing that is in compliance. At the end of the video, there's information on how to obtain the guidelines from HUD.
Of course, for specific legal questions, you should refer to the Fair Housing Act itself. The Act is also a good starting point for our discussion today. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 was a landmark in American civil rights legislation. It prohibits housing discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Those well-known protections have served Americans for decades. In 1988, the Act was amended in profound and important ways. Its protection was extended to families with children and to persons with disabilities. The 1988 amendments also established certain design and construction requirements for new multifamily housing built for first occupancy after March 13, 1991. In a moment, we'll look more closely at those requirements and what kinds of buildings are affected by the law. The law protects all persons with disabilities, hearing and visual disabilities, and mobility impairments. But in this video, our primary focus is on mobility impairments because the Act requires very specific and fundamental elements of design and construction to meet the needs of people with these disabilities.
Let me break in here, Jack. There's something that architects, designers, contractors, and developers need to understand right from the outset. What we're dealing with here is a civil rights issue. The requirements we're talking about today did not evolve from a building code. They are part of a civil rights law that affects the way we build.
Good point. And it's also useful to remember that the Fair Housing Act may not be the only law that applies to your building project. Of course, our focus today is on the Fair Housing Act's requirements, but don't forget, there are other federal laws that may apply to your project too.
And don't overlook state and local laws either. In some places, state and local laws may be more stringent than the federal requirements. In those cases, just meeting the federal guidelines won't cut the mustard. So here's a simple rule of thumb. You must comply with all applicable laws from any jurisdiction.
Absolutely. And remember that the statute gives HUD the responsibility to investigate complaints and seek remedies for violations. Thus, a builder can avoid costly post-construction corrections by ensuring accessibility during the design stage of a project. Obviously, we don't have time today to explain all the details, so our intent here is to define the main scope of the law clearly and simply.
You know, the first thing I wanted to know about the new requirements is what kinds of buildings are covered. First, let's make it clear. The requirements apply to dwellings, places where people live. We're not talking about offices, stores, things like that. Accessibility for those kinds of buildings is covered by other laws and regulations. The Fair Housing Act covers dwellings, and that's our focus today.
And the best way to grasp what dwellings are covered is to understand some key terms and concepts. The Act establishes design and construction requirements for new multifamily housing built for first occupancy after March 13, 1991. Let's put these terms under the microscope. New. The law applies to new construction housing built for first occupancy after March 13, 1991. The law does not require that existing dwelling units be altered, rehabbed, or repaired to make them accessible. The law applies to new construction. First occupancy. This means that the building has never been used for any purpose before March 13, 1991. So the requirements apply to your building if it was newly constructed and never occupied on or before March 13th of 91. There is one exception, and that is if the final building permit was obtained on or before June 15, 1990, and that permit is not later renewed. The final piece of the definition is very important: covered multifamily dwellings. The Act defines covered multifamily dwellings as buildings with 4 or more units. This means all types of housing with 4 or more units in the building: rental apartments, condos for sale, high-rises, garden apartments, and so on. In an elevator building, all units in the building must be made accessible, and the elevators must serve all of the units. In a non-elevator building, all ground floor units are covered. In other words, the accessibility requirements apply to only the ground floor units, but all of them must be made accessible.
And a word to the wise. HUD applies the term ground floor in a practical, common sense manner. There can be ground floors at different levels of the same building. Here's an example. This is a non-elevator building terraced into a slope. The units on the lower level have ground floor entrances from this direction, and the units on the upper level have ground floor entrances from this direction. So all of the units on both levels must be made accessible.
Exactly. Here's another important factor in the definition of a ground floor. Where the first floor containing dwelling units in a building is above grade, all units on that floor must be served by a building entrance on an accessible route. This floor will be considered the ground floor. So if a design places residential units above parking or above retail shops or restaurants, the first floor of those dwellings is considered ground floor, even though it's above grade. Finally, you need to be aware that the law applies to several kinds of covered multifamily dwellings, including custom-designed condos, single-story townhouses, and garden apartments. The rules also apply to vacation timeshares, dormitories, and homeless shelters.
Jack, you might want to mention site impracticality here.
Right. There is a narrow exemption for some buildings constructed on sites that are impractical. Let me emphasize the word narrow. We believe the vast majority of sites are practical, that dwellings built on those sites can and should be made accessible. The burden of proving otherwise is squarely on the persons who design and construct the building, architects and developers.
And if I might interject another word to the wise here, HUD has very specific criteria for determining what is impractical. For example, impracticality applies only to ground floor units in a non-elevator building. So if your building has an elevator, then it must be made accessible, regardless of the site. In addition, non-elevator buildings, regardless of site conditions, must make at least 20% of the ground floor units accessible, and usually more once the site tests have been applied.
Finally, we need to describe the distinction between two significant terms: accessible and adaptable. Accessible generally means that a building is already usable by persons with disabilities. An accessible building usually complies with certain standards for accessibility. Adaptable refers to certain features of design that permit easy conversion to make it accessible in the future. An adaptable dwelling is designed so that it can become fully accessible later, by adding grab bars in the bathroom, for example.
And here's an illustration. Suppose a family has a disabled relative. By making some simple conversions, their adaptable residence can be made into an accessible residence, and their relative can visit them. For example, one of the requirements is for reinforced walls in bathrooms. This is an adaptable design feature because now it's a simple matter of adding grab bars and the bathroom becomes accessible and usable by the relative.
Sandra's example also shows why accessibility is a civil rights issue, not a construction standards issue. That family should have the same opportunities to enjoy the company of their relative, get together for Thanksgiving, visit regularly. It's a rights issue. And with that in mind, let's now take a broad look at the Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines. You need to understand the relationship of HUD's guidelines to the legal requirements. The law sets forth the accessibility requirements. The law says what must be done. HUD's guidelines give technical guidance showing how the requirements can be met. The guidelines are not mandatory in and of themselves. It's possible to meet the legal requirements by following other acceptable standards that produce the same results. Now let's take a closer look at the guidelines themselves. Our goal here is to provide you with an overview of the 7 technical requirements and the simple reasons for them.
And they really are common sense. Let's first scan all 7 requirements. Then we'll look at each of them in more detail.
The building must have an accessible entrance on an accessible route. That means easy-to-use, unobstructed paths from public transportation, from a parking lot, and from sidewalks to the building entrances. Public and common use areas must be accessible to people with disabilities. Doors must be wide enough so that a disabled person can maneuver through them easily. There must be accessible routes into and throughout all the interior spaces of a covered dwelling unit. Light switches, electrical outlets, and environmental controls must be accessible too. The guidelines require that bathrooms have reinforced walls so that grab bars can be added later. Finally, the units must have usable kitchens and usable bathrooms. In kitchens, there must be adequate space to maneuver, and appliances must be arranged so that a disabled person can really use them. For bathrooms, there must be adequate maneuvering space so that the person can enter easily, close the door, use the facilities and fixtures easily, and exit easily.
So, at their core, the 7 technical requirements in the accessibility guidelines are really based on common sense design principles.
Now let's take a closer look at each requirement. The building must have an accessible entrance on an accessible route. Basically, there are 2 simple rules. 1, if there are separate entrances for ground floor units, each entrance must be accessible. 2, if there are common entrances to a multi-unit building, at least one entrance must be accessible. And that entrance must be typically used by residents for entering the building. It cannot be a door to a loading dock or service entrance. An accessible entrance must be located on a route that a person in a wheelchair can easily travel. Accessible routes lead to and from meaningful locations. For example, to parking, to public transportation, to other buildings in the development, and to amenities such as recreational facilities and laundry rooms.
Jack, now's a good time to mention the ANSI standards. ANSI A117.1 is a very useful reference for designers and architects.
In many cases, the federal requirements can be fully satisfied by meeting the specifications in the ANSI standard. Example, the specs for accessible routes can be found in ANSI Section 4.3.
So, the ANSI standards are very useful for complying with HUD's accessibility guidelines.
Good point, Sandra. In fact, ANSI is especially helpful in meeting HUD's second requirement. Public and common use areas must be accessible to people with disabilities. In HUD's usage, public and common use areas embraces a broad spectrum of design elements. Some of the more obvious elements include parking areas, curb ramps, passenger loading areas, building lobbies, lounges, halls and corridors free of protruding objects, elevators, public use restrooms, and rental or sales offices. But the requirement for accessible common use areas also extends to other design elements, such as drinking fountains and water coolers, mailboxes, laundry rooms, community rooms and exercise rooms, swimming pools, playgrounds, recreational facilities, and nature trails.
HUD's accessibility guidelines require usable doors. That includes public and common use doors, such as building entrances, the doors leading into an individual dwelling unit, and all the doors within the dwelling unit itself. For doors in public or common use areas, you can comply with the HUD guidelines by using the ANSI standard. To be usable by a person in a wheelchair, a door must have a minimum clear opening width of 32 inches. Of course, the door itself will intrude slightly into the opening, so this is measured from the face of the door to the stop, with the door open 90 degrees. Remember, you need 32 inches of clear opening for the person to maneuver through. The same principle applies to any doorway: hinge doors, sliding doors, folding doors. There must be a clear opening 32 inches wide so that a person in a wheelchair can use the door. There must also be usable doors leading to any outdoor amenities the dwelling may have, such as a balcony, patio, or deck. And each of those entrances must be accessible. For example, suppose that the unit has a doorway leading from the living room to a deck or patio, and another doorway leading from the master bedroom to the deck. Both doors must be usable.
Sandra's just covered the HUD requirement for usable doors. The next two requirements flow logically from there. Okay, a disabled person opens that usable door to his or her home, and all the doors within are usable too. But that's not enough, is it? Because doors are not the only potential barriers. So the guidelines also require accessible routes into and through units and accessible controls. Let's take a closer look at each of these requirements. There must be an accessible route into and through the dwelling unit. The thresholds of the unit's exterior doors may not exceed 3/4 of an inch. That limit also applies to sliding door tracks. Hallways, passages, and corridors must be wide enough to allow room to maneuver and turn. 36 inches is the minimum clear width necessary for the accessible route inside the unit. In single-story units, changes in height of 1/4 to 1/2 inch must be beveled, and those greater than 1/2 inch must be ramped or have other means of access.
Let me add something here, Jack.
Jump in.
Okay. Now, the requirement for accessible routes through the unit is not going to crimp your style. You can still incorporate special features into your design. For example, in single-story dwellings, design features such as a sunken or raised functional area is okay, provided it doesn't interrupt the accessible route through the remainder of the unit. And lofts are also acceptable in single-story dwellings, so long as all other spaces in the unit are on an accessible route. Oh, one other thing to be aware of. Where the exterior of your building is made of concrete, brick, or other impervious materials, the exterior deck, patio, or balcony surface may be up to 4 inches below the interior floor level to ensure adequate drainage. It's in the guidelines.
You're on a roll, Sandra. You want to go ahead and do the controls requirement?
Sure. Okay, folks, this one's easy. You must have accessible light switches, electrical outlets, thermostats, and other environmental controls. In general, the operable parts of the controls must be no lower than 15 inches and no higher than 48 inches. Of course, if the person must reach over an obstruction, the guidelines specify somewhat tighter limits on the control's location. Essentially, that's it. Just make sure the switches, outlets, thermostats, and controls are accessible. Fairly simple and straightforward.
And the next requirement is also straightforward. The guidelines require that bathrooms have reinforced walls so that grab bars can be installed later near the toilet, tub, shower, and shower seat if provided. The easiest technique is to use plywood or extra 2x4 backing between the studs. The diagrams in the guidelines show you the locations for and acceptable dimensions of the wall reinforcements around the toilet, tub, and shower areas.
Incidentally, the guidelines also explain how you can use alternative methods, such as floor mounts and foldaways. These are useful for glass shower stalls, sunken bathtubs, or if there isn't a surrounding wall.
Now let's turn to the final element of HUD's accessibility guidelines, the requirement for usable kitchens and usable bathrooms. The issues are subtle and the design choices are more complex. All we can do in the video is to highlight the basic idea, the basic concepts. The specific details are explained in the guidelines. The underlying principle of usable kitchens and bathrooms is maneuvering space. In a usable kitchen, there's adequate room for a person in a wheelchair to maneuver and to use the appliances. In a usable bathroom, there's adequate room for a person in a wheelchair to enter, use the facilities, and exit. Sandra, why don't you handle kitchens first?
Sure, I'm glad to do the easier part. The kitchen must have adequate clear floor space so that a person in a wheelchair can maneuver between opposing base cabinets, countertops, appliances, or walls, 40 inches at a minimum. A U-shaped design makes maneuvering more difficult, so there must either be a larger clear area for turning, at least 5 feet in diameter, or cabinets at the location must be removable. And appliances must be located so that a person in a wheelchair can use them. A 30 by 48 inch clear floor space must be provided for a parallel or forward approach. This shows a parallel approach, where the person comes alongside the appliance. A usable kitchen always allows an easy parallel approach at the range or cooktop and at the sink. This shows a forward approach, where the person faces the appliance. A usable kitchen provides a person in a wheelchair either a forward approach or a parallel approach to the other kitchen appliances, such as the oven, dishwasher, refrigerator, freezer, and trash compactor. And that's usable kitchens in a nutshell. The guidelines have the specs, clearances, all that. Okay, Jack, now it's time for the final piece of the puzzle, usable bathrooms.
Usable bathrooms. This is a subtle and slightly more complex topic because you have two choices in how to comply with the requirement. There are two sets of specifications for usable bathrooms. We can't go into all the details in this video, but we can give you the unifying concept behind both options. Here's the concept. A usable bathroom has adequate maneuvering space so that a disabled person can enter, close the door, use the facilities, reopen the door, and exit. And of course, a usable bathroom complies with the other requirements in the guidelines. It's on an accessible route, has usable doors, reinforced walls for grab bars, and switches and outlets in accessible locations. Okay, now let's talk about your choices. The guidelines give you two options, two sets of specs for usable bathrooms. Let's call them option A and option B. The option A bathroom meets the minimum requirements for accessibility that I just described. If you choose option A, then all bathrooms in the unit must meet all of the option A requirements. The option B bathroom affords somewhat greater accessibility. If you choose option B, then only one bathroom in the unit must meet all of the option B requirements, and the other bathrooms in the unit do not meet these requirements, but must have usable doors, be on an accessible route, have reinforced walls, and switches and outlets in accessible locations.
Jack, we need to emphasize that option A and option B are mutually exclusive. It's not mix and match, folks. You're facing an either-or choice. If you go down the option A road, you've got to meet all of the option A requirements. If you choose option B, you've got to meet all of the option B requirements in one bathroom.
Exactly. Now, let's take a quick look at both kinds of bathrooms. In option A, there are several acceptable floor plans for the water closet area of a bathroom, the bathtub area, lavatories, and showers, depending on how the bathroom and its fixtures are configured. Water closets are either located so that grab bars can be installed on adjacent reinforced walls, or located to allow for later installation of the floor-mounted or fold-away grab bars. Clear floor space is a key principle. There must be clear floor space by the water closet, lavatory, bathtub, or shower. With adequate knee space, lavatories may have a forward approach, or you may use a parallel approach. In either case, the clear floor space must be at least 30 inches by 48 inches. It is permissible for the clear floor spaces in the bathroom to overlap, provided there is adequate space for a person to maneuver. The maneuvering spaces may include any knee or toe space available below bathroom fixtures. Also, bear in mind that the door might intrude into the maneuvering space. Therefore, if the door swings in, there must be adequate clear space in the bathroom so that person can easily enter, close the door, use the fixtures, reopen the door, and exit. The option B bathroom provides a somewhat increased measure of accessibility. For example, when the door swings into the bathroom, there must be a space of 30 inches by 48 inches within the room to position a wheelchair clear of the path of the door as it is closed and to permit use of fixtures. The primary difference between the option A and option B bathrooms is the clear floor space required at the bathtub. The option B bathroom requires a 30 by 48 inch clear floor space adjacent to the bathtub, beginning at the foot of the tub. The clear floor space at other fixtures in the option B bathroom is similar to the option A bathroom. Finally, in option B bathrooms, lavatories and vanities must meet some specific design and installation requirements governing height and clearance from adjoining walls or fixtures, as well as requirements for knee space if such space is provided. And that's about it. Usable kitchens and bathrooms. We're done. Anything you want to add?
Nothing I want to add, really, but I would like to reinforce some crucial points. Accessible housing is a federal law. It's a civil rights law. HUD's accessibility guidelines are a safe harbor for complying with it. By meeting the 7 requirements in the guidelines and carefully incorporating them during the design stage of a project, developers can avoid costly post-construction alterations. And housing accessibility is not burdensome or difficult because it's based on common sense design principles. And there are practical source materials to assist you. The ANSI standards are very helpful. And HUD's accessibility guidelines are an essential desktop reference. At the end of the video, there's information on how to obtain it. Get the guidelines and use them. So, how about a refill? I can brew a fresh pot.
Sounds good. By the way, thanks for having me here today.
My pleasure, Jack.